Good morning, one and all. I assume people have seen their grades for the exam. You can add 10 points to that grade, and that's what you've got. I haven't gone through there to change it because you have to do it one at a time. Where did we leave off? Have we written the Constitution yet? Y'all know how to look at that, right? Know how to look at, does everybody know how to look at the recordings of the class? Because we record these classes. Let me see if I can find it on here without. Thank you. Bear with me for a minute and I'll find out. Looking for the URL for the class recordings. I don't have it on here. Bear with me for a minute. I'm going to get that because at any rate, We did this exam last Wednesday, right? So we have not talked about anything since then, which was probably early enough for you. Well, let's talk about a period of time that we call the critical period. Now, what do I mean by that? Can anybody guess? This is a really critical time, right after we get our independence. Why do you think?
Kind of like Reformation, really early.
Yeah, kind of. It's kind of like we really weren't anything. We were a blob. We were 13 states who all valued their independence, not only from England, but from one another quite a bit. A lot of people didn't want to be bothered by togetherness. You can see that kind of characteristic in individuals, let alone states and countries. People like Patrick Henry was happy, okay, to go home and keep on doing his thing and not have to worry about lots of meetings and things like that. So I'm going to put up a set of slides that I think in your notes it's called the critical period. And we talked about, I mentioned it in passing, but during the war, we really didn't have a constitution, but we had kind of a set of rules. Some people call it a constitution, called the Articles of Confederation. We started writing those as soon as we declared our independence, actually a little bit before we declared our independence. And I promise, I think at one point or another, by the way, let's see if I can get this to come up here. Here's some vocabulary that we'll talk about as we go along. Group them in pairs here, unicameral and bicameral. What are we talking about? Probably when we talk about those words. Anybody? It has to do with our government, but what part of the government? It basically means one house or two houses. So we're talking about the legislature. Some countries and some states have a one-house legislature. Some have two. The British have always had two. The House of Lords and the House of Commons. We're going to have two, and we're going to call them the Senate and the House of Representatives, but that's much later, not under this Articles of Confederation. How about republic and democracy? What do we live in? Anybody? Say again? We follow democratic principles, but we don't live in a democracy. We live in a republic. If you don't believe me, say the Pledge of Allegiance. Oh, gotcha, right? All your life you've been brainwashed at that, and you can't remember it? So much for brainwashing. It doesn't work. It wears off. And to the republic for which it stands. What's the difference? Well, if you have a pure democracy, it's like what you call a committee of the whole. Everybody gets to vote on everything. Can you imagine all 375 million Americans voting on everything all at once? I mean, we don't even do that when we're voting for president, you realize. We vote for electors who cast a ballot for the president. Prorogue stands alone. That's the right of a king or a head of state, president if you want, to tell Congress, we don't need you right now, go home. To shut them down temporarily. Charles I did that one time too many and ended up shortened by a head. Federalist and anti-federalist. Put it simply to start with, and it'll get more complex as we talk along, but Federalists basically believed, you might want to write this down, on a strong central government. Anti-Federalists didn't. They feared a strong central government. People like Patrick Henry didn't want a strong central government. We just got rid of one, for heaven's sakes. Why do we want to invent a new one? Other people thought that our country just wouldn't work, wouldn't be able to defend itself, wouldn't be able to develop unless we had a strong central government. If you talk about, oh, look, those are just for your information, just for fun. Presidents of the Continental Congress. Absolutely powerless except to bang the gavel and say things. Our capital moved all over the place. Well, the Continental Congress did anyway. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Philadelphia again, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, York, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia again, New Jersey, Princeton, New Jersey, Annapolis, Maryland, Trenton, New Jersey, and the French Arms Tavern. Now that's not a bad place to have your Congress. City Hall, New York City. And then we'll keep moving even when we have a constitution. This is the man, of course, George Washington. He was a Federalist. He believed we needed some kind of order, and he felt like the Continental Congress was a gaggle of, people just blabbing to hear themselves speak. He'd had to deal with them all the way through the war. Benjamin Franklin agreed with that. John Jay, he'll become our first Chief Justice of the United States eventually, but he's been our minister in Spain during part of the Revolution. He'll become our Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation a little bit later on. He's one of the guys that wrote the Federalist Papers. We'll talk about that in a minute. Eventually be Chief Justice of the United States. He was a Federalist. Alexander Hamilton was certainly a Federalist. The protege of George Washington, who I think was probably not embarrassed to use George Washington's name whenever it was useful to him. Samuel Adams, firebrand, voice of the Revolution in many ways, well educated. He was an anti-federalist. He did not want a strong central government.
You part one on the news and readings?
Yeah. It's, I want to say Unit 4, critical period. You see it?
I don't see it.
Yeah.
You don't see it? Okay, let's fix that.
I think it's prelude or something.
You've got the war, you don't have after that?
Yeah, but you have the American Revolution and
Bear with me. We will take a peek. If I can get to it. The question is, where are these notes? The answer is, who knows until I get in there. And maybe in my draft of the Unit 5 notes, I thought it was in Unit 4. I have to keep answering these questions as I get. What have I got? You are so right. Okay, let's go steal them here. Okay, I'm just going to put up this set so you have it available right now, because there's other things to include. I didn't want to cause confusion by putting up Unit 5 yet. It's in Unit 5, but I'm going to send this over to you guys so you can see it. Life gets confusing. There it is. Okay, it's up at the top of the pile in your notes now, and it's a critical period right at the very top of it. Can you see it now? Okay. Oh, wait a minute, those are the written notes. Drop down to 6, critical period. That's the PowerPoint. Where were we? We were talking about Sam Adams, anti-federalist. He didn't want a strong central government. His cousin John Adams, federalist. He wanted a strong central government. He wrote the state constitution of Massachusetts, and it was the only constitution that was more than 4 or 5 pages long. It was about 20 pages long. Thomas Jefferson, our first Secretary of State, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, he was an anti-federalist. Strongly anti-federalist. James Madison, father of our Constitution. When we talk about the Constitution, he's going to be one of the key people in writing the Constitution, and yet he's an anti-federalist. And we'll see evidence of that pretty quickly. Thomas Paine, we don't even care because he's going to leave the country and go over and join the French Revolution. Critical period. There's the Articles of Confederation. Don't worry about the slide, just worry about the title on it. Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. We were really confident that we were going to last forever, I guess. It didn't give the Continental Congress much power. So a lot of things they couldn't do. John Dickinson's going to be responsible for forming a committee to write it. They'll get done writing it. They won't really have the whole thing. It'll be submitted to the Congress, but it won't be accepted by the majority of the states until 1777. We've already been at war for a whole year. Maryland has a problem with the Articles of Confederation. They see something that's not fair that they want fixed. They started out as a proprietary colony. That means they have borders, very well, mapped out borders, surveyed borders. The charter colonies didn't have borders like that. Remember when they got their charters, it was just between, let's say, between 32 degrees and 33 degrees, somewhere in between there, anywhere. And so they felt they had no western boundary. Obviously, the Atlantic was their eastern boundary. And they were claiming land way out in the middle of nowhere. If you look at this map, Maryland's going to insist they give up all this land they're claiming out in Never Never Land, that they've never really lived in or anything like that. Virginia claims land pretty far out, all the way out to the Mississippi almost. And then they claim land that's on the other side of the Mississippi. Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, all claim land all the way over to the Mississippi River. Georgia, too. And what Maryland says is, you guys aren't living on it. That should be land for everybody, not just for one state. And so gradually all these states give up their claims. Georgia's the last one, and they're going to cause a lot of confusion. And we'll talk about it when it happens, because people have bought and sold that land a number of times before Georgia finally says it doesn't belong to us. So basically, the land was sold when it wasn't theirs to sell. That's going to cause a lot of trouble down the line. We'll talk about it when we get to it. Here's what the articles would allow you to do. If 9 of the 13 states agreed, you could declare war, you could end a war, declare peace, sign a peace treaty, you could conduct foreign affairs, treaties of different kinds. 9 of the 13 states had to agree. You could also, in general, the Congress could help settle interstate disputes. They could coin money. I don't think they did ever. They could arrange a postal service. They were responsible for affairs, Indian affairs out in the West, Western territories. They didn't do a very good job of that. They could requisition. All the way through the war, Congress had no power to tell a state you've got to donate equipment or anything to us. All they could do was beg. So as far as the Articles of Confederation are concerned, requisition means beg. You couldn't amend the articles unless all 13 states agreed, and if you live in a family that's got 4 or more people in it, you'd realize nobody ever agrees on things like that. So basically it was impossible to fix the Articles of Confederation. Also, how taxes were collected, the individual states were collecting taxes, the federal government wasn't getting it. Wasn't getting anything out of it. And the only way they can is to get all 13 states to agree. And of course, the states don't want to give that money up to the central government. What could they not do? Well, what did they not have? They didn't have an executive branch. They had a guy that they called president, but the only power he had was to bang his gavel on the table when they were meeting. No administration at all, no court system, no control of commerce. And they couldn't tax anybody. They didn't have the power to tax. And because of that, they couldn't maintain an army. They certainly didn't have a navy. How are they going to go fight Indians if they don't have an army? You understand, they just didn't have power. I'll give you some examples as we go along here. What have we got? Well, social uncertainty, weak economy, sectionalism, every different location was pulling in a different direction. Complacency. A lot of people were happy. Well, the English are gone. I'm happy. I'm going home. I'm going to live my life. I don't want anything to do with Continental Congress or whatever. And most of them had a great deal of distrust of anyone trying to centralize power. We just got rid of a king. We didn't want to replace him with something that was the same or even worse. We didn't have an identity. Identity is a country, really. We all identified ourselves by what state we were from, that sort of thing. That's a problem I have in modern times, I've got to say. When somebody asks me where am I from, I say from the United States. Because first and foremost, I'm a citizen of the United States. Secondarily, I'm a citizen of Texas or New Mexico. A lot of people don't think that way even now. And when they don't think that way, that's regionalism, where they give locality, hometown, priority over the national interest. That's a problem we have. I'm not saying it's a sin or anything, but it's a problem because it's a big disagreement about points of view. Interstate rivalry. They were taxing each other's products too. If Virginia was making widgets and they sent them to North Carolina, the tax had to be paid on it. They didn't have who was our traditional market? The British. They bought 90% of everything we produced. Suddenly, they're gone. Where are you going to sell it now? We didn't have a merchant marine. We'd used up all our ships in the war, one way or another. Another thing that's a little bit more subtle, when the war broke out, British merchants had a lot of goods in the States in warehouses waiting to be sold, which was just sitting there. And they wanted to make their money back on those goods, but they couldn't. It was difficult to get control of it and get the money on it. So what they did was they sold it for pennies on the dollar. What am I talking about? Okay, let's use widgets again. Everybody knows what a widget is, right? If you do, you're better than me because I don't. It's just something we made up at some point or another as an example. But let's say widgets retailed for $2 a piece. The British want to get some money out of it, otherwise they're going to lose it all. So they start selling them for 25 cents a piece. And if an American company is trying to make widgets and it costs them about the same as it does the British to make them, so they have to sell them for $2 a piece, all that surplus that the British have in the States is dumped on our market and it destroys American industry. That's a problem that we even have in modern times. A lot of people were ignoring the Treaty of Paris, actually should be called the Peace of Paris. The British were still in those outposts along our western frontier. Nobody compensated the Loyalists or anybody for all the property they lost during the war. Spain has grabbed Florida again. And they've also blocked the Mississippi at New Orleans. I mean, they didn't build a chain across the river or anything like that, but if you passed through, you had to pay to get through. That really hurts all of our people west of the Appalachians, if you think about it. A couple of good things that the Continental Congress was able to agree on concern, and don't write this stuff down. Next slide I'll give to you. It'll make sense. Rights of citizenship and how we're going to expand, how we're going to grow. How do we add new states? The first thing is taken, you can write this down if you want, Article 4 of the Articles of Confederation basically puts forth the principle, if you're a citizen of any one of the states in this union, then you're a citizen of all of the union. We've tweaked that a lot over the years. Another thing that this Article 4 of the Articles of Confederation established was the idea of extradition. What am I talking about? Anybody? Come on, you all have to know of a... Okay, let's say I stole your car and drove it over to New Mexico. If you didn't have rights of extradition, guess what? Your car's kiss it goodbye. You can't get me arrested either. I'm in a different state. Texas Rangers can't touch me in New Mexico. Extradition is a process, a legal process you go through where you ask that state to remand the person to another state, or even sometimes another country. People that commit major crimes in the world always look around for some country that doesn't have extradition treaties with the United States, so that they can't be got back. Okay, that's that Article 4. How to become a state is interesting, and another thing just as important to us, we didn't have any income to speak of for the federal government. One way they can make money is to sell land, so they're going to sell some of these western lands that had been claimed before. They're going to survey land up in, and I'll show you, let me see if I get a map. Up in that northwest, they call that the Northwest. We don't call it the Northwest anymore, we call Washington State and Oregon the Northwest. Back then, those territories that were around the Great Lakes were the Northwest. We're going to survey that land into pieces that were 6 miles by 6 miles. You call that a township. And then we were going to sell that land for $1 an acre. This is a math problem coming up, guys. Get ready. They're going to sell for $1 an acre, but the minimum amount you can buy, if you want to buy it, you have to buy 1 square mile. So how much are you going to have to put up? You have to know how many acres in a square mile, don't you? 640 acres in a square mile. It's going to cost you $640 to buy land. That, I mean, you know, in modern day, man, I go for that like nobody's business. Back then, nobody had that kind of money. If you're lucky, that might be your annual salary. So what's going to happen if they're going to sell this land? What's going to happen is that some more profiteers, some companies that have a lot of spare cash, are going to buy the land up. One of them is the Ohio Company, strangely enough named the Ohio Company considering where it was. And the other one is the Scioto Company. There's other companies too. In fact, our friend Robert Morris, the former man, the guy that helped finance the American Revolution, he's going to put a lot of money out there. He's going to lose his butt. He's going to go broke. They're going to buy that land. They're going to chop it up into smaller parcels, and they're going to resell it. It's called land speculation. The other half of this issue, that's the Land Ordinance of 1785. The other part of this is the Northwest Ordinance, and I don't have the year there, it's 1787. And basically it's rules for how you can establish your own government and how you can become a state. Basically, in your territory, 5,000 person population gets you the right to form your own assembly. 60,000 people gets you the right to write your state constitution and apply for statehood. There's a couple of important things to add to this Northwest Ordinance. One was it had a little clause making it illegal to bring slaves north of the Ohio River. If they were fugitive slaves, that was a different story. They could be captured and brought back. The other one is all new states will enter the Union with equal standing with the original states. Some people wanted the original states to kind of be able to lord it over the new guys. But that didn't make much sense because the people in the new territories were people who came from the old territories. They also talked about public education, and that really should be up in the land ordinance. Because every one of those townships, the 36 square miles, 6 by 6, set aside 1 square mile for support of public education. That 1 square mile would either raise money for a school, give a location for a school or whatever, but in some way it would support public education. Now, having said that, and saying that, we were talking about that, we actually didn't have public education in any state until Massachusetts started doing it almost 100 years later. And in the north we had lots of schools. Why? Because remember the little villages and all that up in the Puritan area, those places there were tight-knit little things, and they had their church-sponsored schools. So they had lots of schools. And they had some larger schools. Almost from the word go, they had Harvard for a college. But that was unusual. And in the South, we didn't have all those little nuclear towns. We didn't have any big cities at all. So they didn't have public schools to speak of for a long time. If you had money and you were in the South, if you had a lot of money, you sent your kids to England or someplace like that to study. If you had a little bit of money, but not enough to send them to England, you sent them up to Massachusetts or someplace like that. They just didn't have colleges in the South. Okay, there's our friend Robert Morris. Looks a little bit like a toad, but he's a pretty good guy. He's the one that raised $94 million to help finance the American Revolution. And he gave away a lot of his ships, maybe most of them, to form our Navy. And in 1781, before the war was formally over, he founded the Bank of North America, which is our first kind of a national level bank. But he couldn't raise enough money to really make it a going concern. He was, remember, the superintendent of finance. We didn't have a treasurer under the Articles of Confederation. And his comment about the whole thing was asking for money from the states is like speaking with the dead. And finally he just said, I'm finished. You're not getting any more money out of me. Let somebody else do this. It was like herding cats. And they tried 2 times to change the Articles of Confederation so that the federal government could raise money by taxing, and both times it was defeated because all it took was 1 state to defeat it. So he's gone. He's not going to be the superintendent of finance. We won't have one anymore after him. Okay. Here, now, why is this the critical period? Our country, nobody knows if our country is going to work. All of our, quote, friends, end quote, in Europe, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, they're all sitting around waiting for us to fall apart. I have a picture in my mind. I keep trying to get cartoonists to draw it, and I haven't had success yet, of a little baby Uncle Sam in a little clearing, and perched in all the trees around him are really ugly-looking vultures named France, Spain, England, etc., waiting for Uncle Sam to die so they can swoop down and get the pieces. That was our situation. We had no navy. We couldn't protect our merchant ships out at sea. We had what was left, the framework of an army. Not much. Not enough to defend our own borders. Let's talk about some of the issues that happened. I've got actually more detailed things about each one of these on slides. I'm not going to put them up right now. We had the Newburgh Conspiracy. That's in the year that we signed the treaty ending the war, but it was before the end of the war. A bunch of officers up in Newburgh, right outside of New York City, were unhappy because they hadn't been paid for a number of months. Continental Congress had promised them cash payment. They promised them lifelong pensions, all sorts of things, and they got nothing. And they're thinking, we're in charge of the army. We should be able to go over and maybe pay a visit to the Continental Congress and change their minds about that. Probably one of the guys that was involved in this, although it was never proven, was Horatio Gates. Yes, he made it back even after his 174-mile retreat from the British. He got back in, weaseled his way back into the army. We don't know for sure that he was involved in it, but we do know for sure that one of his assistants was involved in it. They passed this circular petition around. I don't know if you guys know what a circular petition is. It was actually round. The reason it was round was that you signed your names all the way around it like that, so no one could figure out who the first one to sign it was. Go figure. Proposing that they meet and discuss what to do about not getting paid and all that. Someone told George Washington, whose headquarters were right there in that area, and he walks into a meeting of these officers. They all stand up because everyone worshiped George Washington. By that, he was almost a demigod. And he just stares at him for a minute and he says, "We've fought for our independence for 8 years, and you're going to destroy it in 1 hour?" And then he turned around and walked out. And that was the end of that conspiracy. And a bunch of officers started writing him letters, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it," and things like that. Even Gates. Or nightfall. That ended the Newburgh Conspiracy, and over in Pennsylvania and Philly, where the Continental Congress was actually located at the time, a bunch of soldiers, about 400 of them who hadn't been paid and were hungry, decided they'd just take their guns and march over to the Continental Congress right now. The Continental Congress heard about it. They had no army around them to protect them. The army was over in New York. So they went screaming to the governor of Pennsylvania. Actually, they called him a president then. Guess who he was? Good old John Dickinson, author of the Letters of a Farmer of Pennsylvania. He's now in charge of Pennsylvania. They go running over, "Help!" And John Dickinson just looks at him and says, "Looks like you have a problem. Not mine. Bye." So Continental Congress packed their bags and ran for it. Eventually, someone saner in mind is going to go to the soldiers and say, "Chill out, you guys. Everybody's in the same boat. We can't do this." But we didn't. I mean, we had no government structure to deal with it. Then you get a guy named, like a Captain Daniel Shays, spelled S-H-A-Y-S. He was up in Massachusetts, and the problem was, it's a little bit different if you were in North or South. The people in the South still had their slaves, at least most of them still had their farms, still had a way to make money. The people in the North were all involved in trade and shipping and things of that nature. They'd lost all of that during the war. It had been shut down during the war. So the states like New York and Massachusetts, and a little bit like Pennsylvania, but not so much because they had a lot of farming and things like that, they're deep in debt, and they don't know how to dig their way out, so they start putting taxes on their people. Our government as a whole owed about $40 million in debt. That seems like nothing nowadays, right? But back then, that was it was such a large sum no one could understand how much it was. They owed about 11 million to foreign countries. They owed about 30 million or 30 or 40 million to domestic lenders. So Massachusetts just starts slapping taxes. One of the taxes was a poll tax. What is a poll tax? Nobody?
Is it taxing for voting?
Thank you for the answer. It isn't. But we associate it with that, right? Because people use poll taxes to keep people from voting later on. The poll tax is just a head tax. Poll meaning head, Old English. I think if you read old books, sometimes you'll hear somebody got hit in the poll once. And so every head of household had to pay this tax. Rich or poor, you paid the same amount. Soldiers just returning home from the war had nothing, right? If they'd held on to those payment certificates, they had them. They were worthless. Or if they'd sold them to the speculators for 25 cents on the dollar or even less, they had nothing. And what the courts were doing in Massachusetts, they were calling these people in that owed back taxes. What were they doing? They were out fighting the war, right? But apparently they weren't paying their taxes. And they're going to take their property away. They're going to take their cooking utensils away. They're going to take their tools away. Everything they've got except what they're wearing. And then put it on auction to raise money for the state. And Daniel Shays says, you're not going to do that to me. And he gets a bunch of other veterans together, and they decide, let's go shut the courts down. Then they can't take our stuff away from us. And so they go to the Springfield Arsenal, pick up weapons there, and they're going to march on the nearest courts. Massachusetts knows about this well in advance, and they send a message down to the Continental Congress. Help! Continental Congress goes, like to help you, old boy, but we don't have any money and we don't have an army, so we haven't got anything to help you with. So Massachusetts, really panicky. By the way, the whole world's watching these things going on in our country, right? Finally, General Benjamin Lincoln, the guy that took the surrender from Cornwallis at Yorktown, he gets a bunch of other veterans, and they meet these rebelling veterans on the road, and Benjamin Lincoln, who's respected by all of them, steps out and speaks to Shays' rebels and says to them, you know, you fought for something that you're going to hurt if you do this. If you'll all go home, just disappear right now, we'll pretend you never did this, and I give you my word, I will go to the Massachusetts Assembly and tell them they have to fix this right now. And they respected the general, and so they went home, and Lincoln went to the Assembly, and they began changing the laws so this wouldn't happen. And they began changing their tax structure. And when they had their next election, most of the people that wrote those laws to start with are going to be out of a job. But that took extraordinary measures to stop that. And things like that were happening all over our country. Not to mention, along our borders, still doing business with English trading posts, the American Indians were starting to flex their muscles. And what could we do under the Articles of Confederation? Find volunteers to go out and fight the Indians. That does not work real well. And it didn't work real well. And a number of groups of people who went out there to try and deal with the Indians ended up either coming back missing an arm or a leg or not coming back at all. Another problem we had, how are we going to enforce the treaty? We're supposed to have free travel up and down the Mississippi. How did the Spanish get Florida back? We can't do business in the Caribbean. Remember, the British promised us we could do business in the Caribbean, and they still won't let us. How can we leverage them into doing that? We have no power. And then overseas in business, one of the most important places to go in that time was the Mediterranean, because a lot of business out of Asia and a lot of business out of Africa and out of Europe, it all kind of came together in the Med. And back when we were under the English, we could sail back and forth from the Mediterranean because the Royal Navy would protect our ships. But now the Royal Navy doesn't give a hoot about our ships. And the Barbary pirates that came from all those little city-states along the northern coast of Africa, by the way, they weren't all Africans. A lot of them were out of work, people from the Royal Navy, people like that. And they'd capture the American cargo ships, hold their crews for ransom, sell their cargoes off, convert their ships into ships that the people in the Barbary states could use. Then that was really damaging our economy too. Our businessmen couldn't make things work. Not only that, but the French and the Dutch and other people wanted their money back. They'd lent us a lot of money during the war. The French in particular were broke. The Dutch not so bad. In fact, that's going to lead to a revolution in France. And the French were kind of hoping we help the Americans out, maybe we can make them dependent on us for their security and things like that, so we can control them and get our foot back into North America. Big problem for us. Northwest Indian Wars you can talk about, nothing worked. Trying to deal with it. Barbary pirates, that's where they were located. Okay. John Jay was worried about the pirates. He'd served as our ambassador in Spain and other places. And eventually, under the Articles of Confederation, he'll become our, I don't know what they call it, Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. Alexander Hamilton wants to organize the economy. Probably would like to make a little money. And said, this state sovereignty thing is going too far. We can't do anything because every state's pulling in another direction. George Washington simply thought that the Continental Congress was a bunch of rabble. He had to deal with them all the way through the war. He had no liking for the Congress. I guess maybe he started it. Not intentionally. But not being able to get all the states to agree on anything was a big problem. And he's going to start out kind of in a small way. He's a Virginian. Next door to Virginia is Maryland. And they were always arguing about what the border was between Virginia and Maryland. Who owns the Potomac River? That was a major portion of their border. And it was getting to the point where it was getting violent. Who got to collect taxes on the river and things like that. So Washington invites a delegation to come over from Maryland to talk it over with the leaders of Virginia. Then the delegation did show up from Maryland. They came over to Alexandria, but Washington's own Virginians wouldn't come to the meeting. So he apologized, went back home to Mount Vernon, wrote some nasty letters to some of the Virginian leaders. Things that George Washington wrote and said we're listening to. And then once again he invites the Marylanders, this time come up to Mount Vernon. And he tells the Virginians, you come up to Mount Vernon too. And this time they'll sit down and in a reasonable fashion work out the border in between the two states. James Madison saw him doing this. Alexander Hamilton, who was kind of Washington's adopted son almost, saw him doing this. And they thought, if he can do that between two states, why can't we do it between 13 states? Washington doesn't want anything to do with it. He wants to go home to Mount Vernon and be left alone. So James Madison invites in 1786 invites all 13 states to send representatives to Annapolis, Maryland. About 5 states showed up. One state showed up a little bit later, but they'd already adjourned the meeting. So it was kind of a failure, but on the other hand, it wasn't a total failure because they encouraged all the people who did come to the meeting, go to your state and your state's neighbors and wherever you can, and persuade them we really need to fix the Articles of Confederation, one way or another. We need to talk it over. And towards the end of 1786, Alexander Hamilton's going to send out a call, probably using George Washington's name. Everybody knew that he was tightly connected to Washington. He calls for all of the states to send representatives to assemble for a so-called constitutional convention in Philadelphia. By the way, he didn't ask the Continental Congress to support that request. This is all on his own. That was Alexander Hamilton for you. That was James Madison as far as that goes. But the Continental Congress got on board in February of 1787. They said they agreed with this. And so beginning in May, people started showing up in Philly. I think the Virginians were some of the first people to show up. George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, and others. Some states didn't want to send anybody. New York sent three people. One was Alexander Hamilton. He wanted to show up. The other 2 guys weren't really enthusiastic about it. They're going to go home early. They got down to business on the 31st of May, 1787. And after kind of fiddling around for a while, they realized that with all of them together in one room, they couldn't get anything done. So they split up into committees to handle different problems. Let me look at some of the problems. I'm going to flash through these things. Don't get sick to your stomach. Let's talk about some of the influences, first of all. If I can find some. One of the big influences was John Locke. John Locke, as a philosopher, was interested in the relationship between the government and the people who were governed, or the ruler and his subjects, or whatever was on top with all the other people. We already talked about that a little bit. He wrote 2 treatises about that. He called it the social contract. We'd already been reading his stuff. His words went straight into the Declaration of Independence. Another guy they paid attention to was a fellow named David Hume. He died about the time the American Revolution started. His big thing was law. He believed that society was best governed by a general and impartial system of laws. They had to be balanced, not in anybody's favor. In particular, he believed that a republic must produce laws, or it won't survive. Then you've got William Blackstone, probably the most influential of all the justices in the British court system. He wrote about law. Blackstone on law is still read in law school, the Texas Tech Law School. They still read it. Big old thick book, about yay thick, big enough you could use it to help you stand up and reach the top shelf in the kitchen. Some people only use it for that, if they have the book. James Madison, by the way, had a footlocker full of these books by these guys and brought it with him to the convention. Eventually they're going to start calling him the father of the American Constitution, which is really strange because he was an anti-federalist. But he believed in the Constitution, and he believed that we needed a central government that really worked. Who else? Montesquieu. Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brie de Montesquieu. He didn't believe in democracy. How did he influence us? He believed in something else. He said, even if you have a king, you need to have separation of